I grew up in one of those towns where privacy is more myth than reality. Everyone knows everyone, and the walls are thin enough that whispers turn into scandals before noon. It's the kind of place where reputations are currency, and if you screw up, you're paying in public humiliation. I met Emily, my now ex-wife, when we were both barely out of high school. She came from a town about 20 minutes away, where the only notable landmark was a diner with questionable hygiene. She was gorgeous, ambitious, and gave me 3 beautiful kids over the 12 years we were married. I thought we had it all, a comfortable house, noisy but happy kids, and a love that felt unshakable. Then Emily decided she wanted more. And when I say more, I mean something that didn't involve me. It started innocently enough. Emily said she missed working and wanted to pick up a part-time job now that the kids were in school. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but I also wasn't going to stop her from living her life. She ended up getting hired at Bailey's Hardware, the local go-to for overpriced tools and the occasional pack of nails. Her boss, Dave, was the kind of guy who looked like he peaked in high school but never got the memo. He was pushing 40, balding in a way that suggested stress was winning the battle, and carried a gut that would put any Thanksgiving turkey to shame. At first, she just mentioned him in passing. Dave said this, Dave laughed about that. No big deal, right? Then she started mentioning him more and more. Complaining about his management style, his inappropriate jokes, even his cologne that she claimed smelled like desperation mixed with Axe body spray. Funny how someone can spend that much time complaining about a person and still light up when they talk about them. I tried to brush it off. I really did. But the little things started to add up. The late nights inventorying, the sudden interest in wearing makeup to work, and the way she'd always lock her phone when I walked by. I ignored it as long as I could, convincing myself that I was imagining things. But sometimes, denial is just an easy way to avoid an ugly truth. It all came crashing down on a Saturday morning. The kids were out playing, and Emily had gone to the store. I needed to check something online, and when I opened the family computer, there it was, a Facebook chat left open like an accidental confession. The messages weren't even subtle. Flirty texts back and forth between Emily and Dave, peppered with emojis that made my stomach churn. One of the messages was burned into my brain. You make me feel alive again. Alive? After 12 years of marriage, 3 kids, and everything we built together, she was letting Dave, a guy who couldn't even manage his cholesterol, make her feel alive? I stared at the screen, my hands gripping the desk. I read every message, my chest tightening with every disgusting word. It wasn't just flirting. They'd been meeting up. My wife, the mother of my kids, had been sneaking around with this slob. For a moment, I just sat there, trying to process it all. The anger came in waves, hot and relentless, but beneath it was something colder. Betrayal. I thought we were a team. I thought we were building a life together. But it turns out she was busy building something else with Dave. I needed to act. I called our sitter to come watch the kids and started gathering evidence. Every message, every emoji, every little detail went onto my printer. I made sure there were multiple copies because I wasn't just confronting Emily, I was about to make Dave's life miserable too. Once the sitter arrived, I didn't hesitate. I drove straight to Dave's house. Small-town living has its perks, and finding someone's address isn't exactly rocket science when everyone knows everyone. His wife, Karen, opened the door. She looked like the kind of woman who had spent years putting up with Dave's nonsense, her face carrying a quiet exhaustion. I handed her the printed messages without a word. As she started reading, her face twisted in disbelief, then horror. By the time she reached the second page, her hands were trembling. "Is this?" she stammered, her voice cracking. "Yes," I said, my tone flat. "It's exactly what it looks like." Karen broke down, sobbing into her hands as I stood there awkwardly. She packed a bag for herself and her kid while crying into her phone, likely calling her mother or a friend for help. I didn't offer her any comforting words. My sympathy had its limits, and right now, I needed to focus on the next step. After leaving Dave's house, I headed straight for Bailey's Hardware, the crime scene of their pathetic little affair. The place was as ordinary as it gets, rows of tools, paint cans, and employees who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Emily was at the front counter when I walked in. Her face went pale the moment she saw me, her eyes wide like a kid caught stealing candy. The room seemed to freeze, the usual hum of small-town chatter replaced by an oppressive silence. "Where's Dave?" I asked, my voice calm but sharp enough to cut glass. She stammered something unintelligible, her gaze darting around the room as if she could escape the inevitable. I didn't wait for her to finish. My target was in the back office, and I intended to make this as personal as possible. Dave was sitting in his office chair, scrolling through his phone, looking every bit the man who thought he was untouchable. He didn't even notice me until I was standing in front of him. "What the?" was all he managed to say before I grabbed him by the collar and yanked him out of his chair. "Let's take this outside," I growled, dragging him through the store like a sack of garbage. He sputtered protests, but nobody intervened. Emily followed a few steps behind, her voice shrill and panicked, but I ignored her. The back alley was empty, the perfect spot for what I had planned. I slammed him against the wall, the pent-up fury in me finally spilling over. "Is this how you spend your time at work?" I hissed. "Sneaking around with my wife, ruining my family?" He tried to speak, but my fist answered before he could. It wasn't elegant or controlled, just raw, unfiltered anger. Every punch landed with the weight of betrayal, and by the time I was done, his face was a swollen mess. He whimpered like a scolded dog, his dignity bleeding out along with the cut above his eye. At one point, he tried to beg for mercy. "I'm sorry, man. I didn't mean." "Didn't mean." I interrupted, my voice icy. "Didn't mean to screw my wife? Didn't mean to blow up my life? You're pathetic." By the end of it, Dave was slumped against the wall, his pride and a good portion of his face thoroughly smashed. I crouched down to his level, staring into his one good eye. "If you don't want the whole town to know why your wife left you, you'll keep your mouth shut," I said, my tone calm again. "But trust me, they'll find out soon enough." I walked back into the store, my knuckles raw and smeared with Dave's blood. Emily stood frozen behind the counter, her face a cocktail of fear and shame. I grabbed a towel from a nearby display, wiped my hands clean, and tossed it onto the register. "You can consider this your notice," I said flatly. She tried to speak, her voice shaking. "Please just let me explain." I held up a hand to silence her. "Explain what?" "How you threw away 12 years for that sack of crap in the alley." "Don't bother." The bell above the door jingled as I walked out, leaving her standing there, her eyes brimming with tears. When I got home, I didn't waste time. Emily's things went into bags and boxes with ruthless efficiency. Every drawer I emptied, every item I packed, felt like shedding a layer of betrayal. By the time I was done, the house felt cleaner, lighter, even. I drove back to the hardware store, threw her belongings into the trunk of her car, and waited. She came out a few minutes later, her face streaked with mascara. "You've embarrassed me, our family, and yourself," I said coldly. "You want to live like trash? Fine. Go stay with your parents, or him. I don't care. But you're done here." She sobbed, clutching at the door handle of her car. "And don't worry about the kids," I added. "They think you're helping your mom. I'll explain the truth when they're old enough to understand." I didn't stick around to hear her response. By then, I'd had enough of her tears. That night, I found myself at my buddy Mark's house. Mark was the kind of guy who always knew how to handle a crisis, and his heavy bag took the brunt of my frustrations while he cracked jokes to keep me sane. "You should have charged him a copay for that beating," he said with a grin. "Trust me, I gave him the deluxe package," I replied, managing a laugh for the first time that day. By the time I got home, I felt a little lighter. I hugged my kids tightly, the weight of the day settling into something manageable. A week later, a letter arrived in the mail. It was addressed to me in Emily's handwriting, the neat, flowing script that used to feel like home. I didn't want to open it. I wanted to toss it straight into the trash and move on. But curiosity has a way of winning these battles, doesn't it? I sat at the kitchen table and unfolded the paper. It was exactly what I expected, a long, emotional confession drenched in regret and self-pity. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she wrote. "I don't even know if I can forgive myself. What I did with Dave was a terrible mistake, and I will regret it for the rest of my life. I was lost, and I let myself be swept away by something I didn't understand. You were everything to me, and I betrayed you, the kids, and everything we built together. I will always love you, and I hope someday you can find it in your heart to forgive me. The words were sincere, I'll give her that. But they were also useless. No letter, no tearful apology, could undo the damage she'd caused. I crumpled it up and threw it in the trash. Closure? Please. Closure wasn't coming from some heartfelt words on a piece of paper. It would come from living my life without her. But later that night, as I stood in the kitchen with a drink in hand, I found myself fishing the letter out of the trash. I read it again, trying to figure out if it changed anything. It didn't. I grabbed a match from the drawer, lit it, and set the letter ablaze. Watching those words turn to ash felt more satisfying than I expected. It was a small act, but it gave me a sense of finality, a way to burn away the last remnants of what we had. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a strange new rhythm. Lawyers were contacted, custody agreements were drafted, and I started to explain the situation to the kids in the gentlest way possible. They were resilient, stronger than I expected. As for Dave, he never called the cops. Maybe he was too ashamed, or maybe he knew he deserved every bruise. Either way, I didn't hear a peep from him. Emily, on the other hand, became the town's favorite topic of gossip. In a place like this, news spreads faster than wildfire. She moved in with her parents for a while, then started bouncing between apartments and jobs. I heard through the grapevine that she and Dave didn't last long. No surprise there. He was a loser, and she was a woman who traded a stable life for a few cheap thrills. Years went by, and the pain dulled into a manageable ache, like an old injury that only hurts when the weather changes. Life moved on, as it tends to do. The kids grew older, stronger, and I found myself rebuilding, piece by piece. Then one day, I reconnected with Sarah, an old classmate I hadn't seen since high school. She was everything Emily wasn't, kind, steady, and honest to a fault. We started talking, then dating, and before I knew it, I was falling for her. Sarah embraced my kids like they were her own, and when we eventually got married, it felt like the fresh start I didn't realize I needed. We even had a daughter together, a little girl who brought light into a life that had once felt so dark. Every now and then, I'd hear about Emily. She became something of a cautionary tale in our town, a woman who had it all and threw it away. She bounced from one bad relationship to the next, never quite finding her footing. A part of me wanted to reach out, maybe to offer some kind of help. But another part of me knew it wouldn't matter. She made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. As for me, I've moved on. When I look around now, at my wife, my kids, and the life we've built, I feel a sense of peace I didn't think I'd ever find again. The past doesn't define me. It's just a scar, a reminder of the lessons I've learned. Life goes on, and so do we.